Revising what we did last time, we started off with Freud's topographical model of the mind, and we said the mind can be seen in three compartments: conscious, pre-conscious, unconscious. Conscious is that part we are aware of at the moment. Pre-conscious, which can be brought to awareness, activated on demand. Unconscious is that which is difficult to retrieve even when we will to do so, and it is kept unconscious by the repressive force exerted at the repression barrier that separates the pre-conscious from the unconscious. Any doubts on this? Fiona, any doubt on this?
No.
Okay. Then we took a look at the next model, structural model, and we brought in three agencies: id, ego, superego. And we said id is a reservoir of primitive instincts, desires, and fears. Ego is the coordinator, the agent of reality, who creates a very good compromise between id and the superego. And superego is the moral part of us: thou shall not. Okay. Any problems with this?
No.
Okay. Can you think about what can go wrong in these three, in the coordination between the three? Id, ego, and superego. Possibility one: what would happen if id is too strong and cannot be controlled by ego and superego? What would happen? What kind of pathology will come about?
I think the person would be very immoral sort of in his or her actions.
So the psychopathy, sociopathy spectrum, the violent spectrum will come out if the id is too strong to be handled by ego or superego. What would happen if the superego is too strong? What kind of pathology will come in? If the moral part is very strong, what will be the problem?
Maybe obsessiveness and guilt.
Yes, right. So when we call it superego pathology, when the excessive harshness of the superego creates problems. So we can have shame related problems, we can have guilt related problems. Guilt is the most prominent thing that we see. And we can see how guilt can create punishment for oneself. Guilt may not allow the healing process to proceed. Guilt may not allow us to enjoy the pleasures of life. I experienced the guilt in a very strange way. This attack of guilt. I am sure all of us experience something or the other. But when everything is going fine and I am having food, which is exactly something that I would like, and a huge amount of pleasure is about to be in me, right? In the chewing of the food, often I cut something here. How would you explain that pathology?
I think you
can't bear too much pleasure.
Sorry?
Can't bear too much pleasure.
Yeah, can't bear too much pleasure, don't deserve too much pleasure. And what would be the explanation for don't deserve too much pleasure? You deserve to be punished if you deserve pleasure.
Punishment, yes.
Yeah. So what would be the unconscious dynamic for it? Some possible unconscious dynamics?
sense of good breast or something like whenever uh, earlier childhood, whenever having good breast at that time, uh, got some punishment at that time.
Right. So one dynamic can be uh, the good experience has to be followed by a guilt attack or some sort of punishment. Otherwise, the cycle is not complete. And something horrible will happen if this cycle is not complete. But if a small incident happens, you can be saved from a larger attack. One dynamic. Second dynamic can be unconscious Oedipus.
Oedipal,
Yes.
yes, Oedipal.
Unconscious dynamic can be Oedipus, that because the Oedipus is unresolved, the guilt attacks you. Third dynamic can be the unbearability of the pleasure itself, which is not so relevant in me, but it can be in some people. The fourth can be the murderous and torturous rage towards the parents, which is succeeded by a guilt which attacks oneself. Okay. So because that torturous rage has not been completely brought out, the guilt exists and the guilt sabotages the movement of pleasure. One more dynamic can be the pleasure of masochism. So all these dynamics are possible. What would happen if the ego does not function well?
Psychic breakdown.
All sorts of adaptation and compromise problems, because ego creates a adaptation to reality. So let us say in the compromise formation between the three forces, id, superego and the environment outside, if ego creates a compromise with too much of superego, you find it difficult to operate in the practical world. Too much of id, you are on the difficult side of law. And in psychological terms, we would say the deployment of defenses would not be optimal. Is it clear? Or any questions? Okay, if it's clear, then let us move ahead. I will start with today's topic. Today we have to enter, we started last time with preliminary communication. So we'll continue today with preliminary communication and the case of NAO. We'll also try to look at how the case of NAO looks if you look at it from today's standpoint. Okay. Can you see the screen or?
Yeah, but old one. Structural model.
Let me start the new one. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So what I'll do is, before we go into reading Freud in original, which can be slightly difficult, I'll get into a few explanations and then we'll go into the reading of Freud. Is it fine? Just go that way. It will be easier. Okay. So we have started off with studies on hysteria, and we are going into the mechanism of hysteria. And this is obviously the beginning of psychoanalysis by discovering how something which can have a biological explanation or a manifestation rather can have psychological roots. So when we say hysteria of the time that Freud used to be there, we are talking of manifestations of hysteria in many ways. Convulsions, neuralgia, anesthesias, contractures, paralysis and pains. Convulsions you all understand. Pains of nerve, nervous pain, neuralgia, anesthesias. Right? So you feel a nervous pain where there is no biological reason obviously available. You feel some part of the body has got numb, even though biologically is nothing wrong. You can feel contractures at different parts of the body. You can feel localized paralysis and you can find localized pains. And all of them were put together under the name of hysteria. Is it clear or is it confusing? The way this word hysteria was used in those times?
Yeah, clear.
Okay. So the mechanism of hysteria was slowly discovered by Freud, and essentially he talked about talking cure. So we will see how in the case of NAO, the talking cure came about. So the first thing was something psychological, a strong psychological event can give rise to events in the body like convulsions, neuralgia, anesthesias, contractures, paralysis and pains. And all of these are hysterical problems. No biological cause can be found for them. And hysteria was cured by hypnosis and free association, both clubbed together, or talking cure. And then talking cure later on was used more for free association. The mechanism was found like this. There was a causal event, and that causal event triggered off some form of hysteria. It may be, in case of NAO, we will see that she had been to a friend's house and there she saw the friend's dog drinking a bit of water from a glass, and then she was offered a glass water in the same glass. Out of not being impolite, she took that water, but it was so disgusting that she developed a long-term revulsion to water and she stopped drinking water. It was very difficult for her to drink water. So this hysterical avoidance of water, hysterical disgust at water, at times even hysterical fear at water. So there was this causal event that Freud says it can be that while you are taking dinner, somebody says something or you develop an idea which is disgusting. And the disgust which is developed during the dinner event is then put on any food item, and that food item then becomes disgusting. Today we know it very clearly. This is almost the mechanism of phobia. That fear from somewhere else is put onto an innocent object, and the innocent object then becomes an object of phobia. Okay. So there is a causal event which triggers off the hysteria. And the causal event, when you bring to the notice of the person, and the idea and the effect of the causal event both are consciously felt and integrated, the hysterical symptom goes away. So this is what Freud found, that when a person comes and says, I find it disgusting to drink water, and we ask the person, how did it start? And the person says, the last event I can think of is this event. After this event, somehow I never felt like drinking water. I may do it out of compulsion, but I don't like it. So when you go into that event, what happened in that event? That causal precipitating event. And there, whatever happened in terms of idea and effect, if we bring it both to the notice, the conscious notice of the person and integrate it, the symptom goes away. Interestingly, Freud discovered that if you integrate only the idea into the conscious mind, the symptom does not go away completely. And therefore, integration of affect is also very important. Both when they are made conscious and integrated, the symptom goes away. Now, how does a symptom gets created? So Freud says there are many ways in which the symptom can get created. For example, there can be a literal creation of a symptom, like a dog drinking water from a glass, you drinking water from the glass, and you dislike water, you are disgusted. A direct creation of the event. There can be a symbolic creation of the event, meaning in the case of NRO, let us say she was nursing her father who was sick, and in the course of nursing her father, a sexual thought arises in her, and the sexual thought towards her father is evaluated as disgusting by her own superego, and that disgust is then put on something else, and that thing becomes disgusting. So something from one is put into another, and that new thing where you feel the disgust is symbolically related somehow to the father. So maybe you start feeling disgust about the type of product your father used to use, or something that is related to your father. Yeah.
So, is it safe to draw a connection between, if someone has a lot of phobias, is it safe to say that their superego is very high?
Not necessary, because in many cases we see that it is not only the harshness of the superego which creates the guilt, but the event itself is such that it will create disgust in most of the people.
Right.
So that will be one part of it. The second part of it is there is also a connection between the relative strength of the id and the superego. The difficulty arises when both of them are very strong.
Okay.
Because if the superego is very strong and the id is not equally strong, I mean, relatively speaking, self-destruction and self-beating is very common, but phobic reaction is not necessarily always the outcome.
Yeah.
One of the ways of looking at the phobic reaction, if you go into how the anxiety is generated, it can also be seen in a different light as an operation of the ego. In the sense, let us say the split is open, and if the split is open and the anxiety is being generated, the fear of the attack of the bad breast can be put onto the phobic object. So what will happen here is the relative low strength of superego will not matter as much as the ability of the ego to close the split. Because the split cannot be closed, anxiety generation cannot be stopped, and because the ego does not have the strength to repress the anxiety successfully, it has to do something, and that something can be displacing the anxiety on an innocent object, making it phobic. Okay? That can also be one more situation, but what you said is correct. If the superego is very strong, that can be one situation for a phobia. provided the superego is harsh in creating the anxiety related to guilt or shame because of its own harshness. So that can be definitely one situation, not the only situation, definitely one. So when we look at the manifestation of hysteria, we see three situations. One, a literal creation related to the event, like the dog drinking water, I drink water, I develop disgust to water. Symbolic relation to the event. The NO is with her father. She develops a sexual thought about the father, feels disgusted about it, and then puts that disgust onto something related to the father, something that reminds her of the father, something that can be associated to the father. So through association, let us say she hypothetically assume that there is a daughter who is taking care of the father, and the father smokes cigarettes. And while taking care of the father, the daughter develops some unconscious Oedipal desire, some Oedipal thought, and then feels disgusted unconsciously. And then the father is smoking cigarettes, so on the cigarettes, the disgust is put, and whenever she sees the cigarette, she feels disgusted. So she can't make out why she feels disgusted about the cigarette. She never smoked a cigarette, she never had a desire to smoke the cigarette, and she was not the anti-smoking type anyway. So she does not have a medical problem, a moral problem, nothing of that sort. And yet she feels disgust when she sees a cigarette. And if she goes into therapy and explores deeply, this will come out that while nursing her father, some Oedipal thought came up, disgust was generated because of guilt, and that disgust was put on cigarettes which father used to smoke, and therefore there is a connection between the disgust felt to the cigarette and the disgust which was felt when Oedipal desire related to the father was generated. So the hysterical event looks independent and isolated, but if we go deeper, it is related to something symbolically in the unconscious mind. So no matter how disjointed, how autonomous, how independent a hysterical symptom seems to us, it is related to something in the unconscious mind. Second situation. Third situation, it is related in sense of meaning to the original event. So this is a more abstract, more distant way a symptom can be related. Let me take example given by Carl Jung. Carl Jung was among first people, of course Freud was also among them, but this group was among the first group in modern times which looked at meaning of something which was thought of to be psychotic. So what people would dismiss as delirium, as acts of a madman, they saw meaning in that madness. That what was dismissed as madness actually was a deeply symbolic communication. And this communication was suggestive of an emotional trauma. So there was meaning into it expressed in a coded language. The symptom has a story. Behind every symptom is a story. The symptom is expressing the story in a coded language. Our job as a therapist is to decode it and arrive at the real story in the unconscious mind, which is expressed in a coded way by the symptom. So behind every symptom is a story. So this is what our job is, that after we take the case history and we know the complaints, we have to arrive at the story behind the complaint. So that is the method of psychoanalysis. So Jung gives a very good example. Jung says he saw a psychotic lady who had been psychotic for more than 7 to 10 years, and her psychosis was like this. she had withdrawn completely, was talking to very few people, talking very few words, and most of the day she would do gestures like this, as though she was teaching something. And she would be on the roadside or be in the helping house or some social infrastructure created by somebody. So she would be practically roaming about, or she would be put up by somebody for some time. And most of the time she would be doing this stitching activity, stitching action. And most people dismiss this as something of a madman's delirium in action, so to say. Jung went deeper into it and he found that this lady had a lover who was a cobbler, and the cobbler used to stitch shoes, and therefore the cobbler abandoned her, ditched her, left her, and after the cobbler left her, she went psychotic over a period of time, and now she is doing this particular activity which is related to that precipitating event of her abandonment by the cobbler. So this is the event where the hysterical action or hysterical event is related to something distant in some sense of meaning. So there are various ways in which a traumatic event can happen, and that can lead to some manifestation of a hysterical symptom, and this process of manufacturing of the symptom may go according to any of these three routes. It may take the literal route, it may take an associational symbolic route, or it may take the meaning route, or it may be a combination. So that is how strange symptoms are created. Because of this way the mind works, that the creative power of the mind is used even in creation of the symptoms. Any questions on this?
No, sir.
So we go ahead. We see that there is a traumatic event. The traumatic event leads to a symptom, and then the symptom seems to have an independent existence. Okay. It's very difficult for anybody who is not trained into psychoanalysis to find that the so-called independent symptom can have some roots in the history of the person. And even more difficult to trace that the symptom can be related to something in the childhood. For example, let us say a person is asthmatic. Take my own case. Let us say if I am asthmatic and I suddenly find my asthma is aggravating, and I don't know what happens because I have controlled everything, food, diet, so everything I have controlled. And then I realize that I may have faced loss of a person in my life, and that may have aggravated the problem. So if I go deeper, then I realize this is related to an early life object loss. So a problem I report to the doctor at the age of 35, 40 is rooted in something which I was 3 months old, 6 months old, 2 years old, something of that sort. So this is second important element. Third element is there is one core path of creation of the symptom, and then tributaries join in. It is like...
So how do you relate loss of a person in your childhood to your asthma rising?
Okay. I was told by my parents that I had some breathing difficulty, not sure asthma or what it was, but some breathing difficulty when I was about 2.5 years old, and I was admitted to the hospital for 2 to 3 days. And at that point, I asked my parents what event could it be, and they said nothing happened. It was just a season change and something happened. And I said, before that, when would it happen? They said about 4 to 5 months of age. And that is where my mother had started working, and she had joined office. So this early life object loss would lead to, at that point, some sickness. Right? And the sickness was not yet completely related to breathing. But the same thing happened after 2 years, and I was admitted. And at that point, I was told, my father had come back after some transfer or something. Right? And my mother had started working again after some leave. So that was second. In adult life, I realized after the marriage of my sister and after the death of my mother, I had 2 losses, and both of them aggravated asthmatic problem. So observation in the adult age and reported incidents of the early childhood that lead us to a probable link between the two. Is it getting clear?
Yeah.
That in early life, the mother starts working and the child falls sick. The father comes back after the transfer and the child falls sick because there is a loss of the mother to the father. And in adult life, you lose 2 important people in your life and the asthma aggravates. If you look at my lung function test reports, when these 2 losses happened, the lungs were operating at 22%, which is never the case with me generally. It's the lowest. Usually it is 33%. So we can see the outcome also in terms of tests done by instruments, and we can do it repeatedly to see this in many cases. I am not an authority on asthma, but on my own experience, I do believe this to be a reasonable mechanism of it. But let me not generalize my personal experience. Let me go by the published instances. Okay. So the published case studies, peer reviewed, they tell us about these things, that usually we find there is one root of creation of the symptom. For example, either anger or pain or some strong affect creates a symptom in the mind or the body. It's like creating the Ahmedabad-Baroda Express highway and then tributaries join in. So once you have created the highway, other tributaries join in, affect which is either the same or different from different events, they join into this whole constellation. The mechanism also Freud found the event was usually connected, right, to childhood event. And the early childhood event was actually the core, and this is true. And this is what Freud repeatedly found, and therefore he was led to the concept of the psychosexual stages of development, which we will see later. Any question on this? This is the content by and large, the central idea of preliminary communication. So today we are going to read 2 things in the original: preliminary communication and the case of NAO. Preliminary communication, this is the core, that hysteria can come in these different forms. It can be engaged with by talking cure. There is a causal precipitating event after which the first symptom comes. Healing happens when that causal event is revisited and idea and affect both are made conscious and integrated. And hysteria, the form of hysteria or the form of symptom can be manufactured related to the original event in a way that there can be a literal creation of a symptom, there can be a symbolic relation to the causal event, or there can be a meaning association to the causal event. But the symptom is, although it seems independent and disjointed, it is never independent and disjointed. It is always connected. Okay? You may have a wireless connection, but there is always a connection to some causal event, and that causal event itself can be a childhood event, or your causal event is linked to a deeper childhood event, which is like the master event for the whole constellation. Right? So, the disgust of the dog drinking the water may be related to the Oedipal disgust of 4 to 5 years of age. So the causal event may not necessarily be the deepest event in the sequence. If we explore the effects and the meaning of the causal event, that by association leads us to something more basic, which is in the childhood, the core early life event, around which similar events join into a constellation. But that is the nucleus. It's like the hub and the spoke. The hub is the real childhood event, and then there are spokes on which other events are situated, which may be precipitating events for some symptoms, or the core childhood event may directly be creating symptoms. Both are possible. We'll have to get into a new session. So let me send you a link.